Welcome to Whispers of Time. I'm your guide on a journey backward through the deepest corridors of human memory, to a moment so ancient, so foundational, that its echoes still vibrate through every tool you have ever held, every task you have ever accomplished with your hands. In this place, let me ask you something. When did you last stop to think about your hands? Not to admire them, not to use them for their endless tasks, but to really wonder about them. These remarkable instruments that move with such fluid grace, that can create and destroy, that can comfort and express. Your hands are ancient, impossibly ancient. They carry within them the memory of millions of years of ancestors learning, reaching, grasping and creating. For most of human history, we didn't have much. We didn't have houses with 4 walls and roofs to shield us from the rain. We didn't have domesticated animals or fields of grain. We didn't have the comfort of fire at first, or the security of permanent settlements. What we had, what our ancestors had, were their bodies and their minds. And most importantly, we had our hands. The story I'm about to tell you is not one of sudden discovery or brilliant invention. It is the story of incremental awakening, of a spark that grew so gradually, so imperceptibly, slowly, that those living through it probably never realised they were witnessing the birth of human consciousness itself. It is the story of the first tools, and through them, the story of what it means to be human. Imagine, if you will, a landscape so vast and so unfamiliar that if you walked into it tomorrow, you would scarcely recognise it as the same planet. Picture Africa, not the Africa you know from photographs or documentaries, but Africa as it existed 2.6 million years ago. The air would smell different. The sky above would seem deeper, wilder. The wind carries scents of vegetation and animal musk across plains that stretch endlessly toward horizons you can barely comprehend. The sun beats down with an intensity that demands respect and fear in equal measure. This is not a comfortable world. This is a world of struggle, of hunger, of constant calculation about survival. Every moment carries the weight of life and death. And somewhere in this landscape, moving across the red earth and through sparse acacia forests, are our ancestors. They are not yet fully human. Their bodies are still adapting, their minds still developing, but they are conscious. They are aware. They are beginning to ask questions about the world around them, questions that their bodies and instincts alone cannot answer. These ancestors of ours did not have the advantage of inherited knowledge from a vast civilization. They had only each other, their senses, their growing curiosity, and something that stirred in their expanding brains. A glimmer of imagination. Imagination, that faculty that would eventually transform everything. The ability to see not what is, but what could be. To imagine a future different from the present. To see a stone and think, this could be different. This could be useful. This journey we're about to take together is about that crucial moment, not a single moment, but a period spanning thousands of years, when our ancestors learned to take the raw materials of the earth and transform them with intentionality and purpose. It is about the first technology, the first systematic and deliberate modification of nature by thinking beings. It is about the moment when we began to cease being merely part of the animal kingdom and started to become something new. But before we arrive at that moment of innovation, we need to understand what came before. We need to walk in the footsteps of those early ancestors and feel the weight of the world they inhabited. We need to understand what they lacked, what they yearned for, and what finally drove them to that revolutionary act, picking up a stone and deliberately changing it. This is the story of the lost wisdom of toolmaking. Not wisdom that has been forgotten, but wisdom that was being created in those ancient moments, handed down through time, carried in the very marrow of our bones and the very structure of our hands. As we move through this story, pay attention to what you feel. Notice the tension and the triumph. Notice the small moments that echo across millennia. Because in understanding how our ancestors made their first tools, we begin to understand something essential about ourselves, about what drives us to create, to solve problems, to imagine better futures. So settle in, make yourself comfortable. The journey begins not in a laboratory or a university, but under African stars. It begins in the red dust and the long grass. It begins when a consciousness that was barely human yet, faced with a problem it could not solve with its body alone, reached down and picked up a stone. Let me take you to the Afar region of Ethiopia, deep into what is now called the Rift Valley. Imagine the date on an ancient calendar, one that measures time not in centuries or millennia, but in millions of years. We're setting our imaginary clock to approximately 2.6 million years before our present day. The landscape here is dramatic, with steep ravines cutting through plateaus, creating natural boundaries and barriers. The climate is already becoming variable. Some seasons bring rain that fills temporary lakes and rivers. Other seasons bring drought so severe that the land cracks under the heat and the green things wither. In this challenging environment, our ancestors have already undergone profound changes. They walk upright. This was no small thing. Somewhere along the evolutionary path, somewhere in the previous few million years, a group of our primate ancestors abandoned the four-limbed locomotion of their closest ape relatives and committed fully to bipedalism. By the time our story begins, this commitment has been refined, perfected, ingrained into their very skeleton. They stand taller than modern humans, their proportions slightly different, longer arms, shorter legs relative to torso, but unmistakably upright. What does this upright posture mean? It means that the hands are freed from the demands of locomotion. The hands are no longer needed to carry the body across the landscape. They are available for other tasks. They are available, though our ancestors do not yet know it, for creation. The creatures living in this world are not yet fully human in the way we understand humanity. Many of them belong to a lineage called the Australopithecines, southern apes, though they are far more than apes. Different species within this group existed at different times, with overlapping ranges and lifespans measured in millions of years. Some were more gracile, built for efficiency and quick movement. Others were more robust, with powerful jaws and thick muscle attachments that suggest a diet heavy in tough foods that required significant processing with the teeth. Some scholars propose that by the time tool making emerges in the archaeological record, around 2.6 million years ago, our ancestors may have already transitioned toward Homo habilis, or early forms of Homo, though this remains an area of active scientific debate. What is clear is that the tool makers were bipedal primates with growing brains and sophisticated hands. Life for these creatures is a constant negotiation with hunger. The world is not particularly generous. There are no cultivated fields, no domesticated animals, no stored food supplies. Every meal must be hunted or gathered or scavenged from the kills of other predators. Every day carries the possibility of eating well or going hungry. Every night brings potential danger from creatures larger and faster and more naturally equipped with claws and teeth. Their bodies are adapted for this life. They have good distance vision, which helps them spot both food sources and predators across open landscapes. Their digestive systems can process a wide variety of plant and animal matter. They have senses that work reasonably well in the environment they inhabit. But they are not the apex predators of their world. A lion, a hyena, a powerful wild dog. These animals are far more dangerous, far more capable of bringing down large prey. Our ancestors exist in a middle tier of the food chain. They are predators themselves, but they are also, by necessity, scavengers. The food they eat is available but scattered. Plant foods require knowledge, knowing which plants are safe to eat, which parts of which plants are most nutritious when specific fruits ripen or tubers become available. This knowledge is hard won. There must be a process of learning and observation, trial and error, of watching and remembering. Meat, when available, provides crucial nutrients, protein, fat, minerals. But processing meat is difficult without proper tools. If you have only your teeth and your hands, tearing into a carcass is slow, inefficient work. The tough hide resists your efforts. The joints are difficult to dislocate. Much of the nutritious value remains locked inside bones you cannot break. Imagine being in this situation. You see something useful, perhaps a dead antelope that other predators have abandoned. Its meat is still good, but accessing it requires effort that your body is not optimally designed to provide. Your teeth can gnaw at exposed flesh, but the hide is too tough. The joints won't bend the way you need them to bend. The bones that contain the marrow, that rich, energy-dense marrow, are simply impenetrable to your natural tools. In this moment of frustration, something extraordinary happens. It is happening to our ancestors somewhere in these African landscapes, not once, but repeatedly, across generations. They are beginning to notice something about the world around them. They notice that stones break. They notice that when a stone falls from a height, it can shatter into sharp pieces. They notice that dead animals sometimes lie among rocky ground, that occasionally stones break naturally, creating edges. And then someone reaches down and picks up one of these sharp stones. Perhaps at first it happens by accident. Perhaps a hominin simply grasps a stone with a sharp edge and finds that it works better for their purposes than their hands alone. Perhaps the first tool making is not intentional creation, but fortuitous discovery. They make the connection. This object is useful. When they use it, their work becomes easier. When they don't have it, their work is harder. This connection, this simple observation, is profound because it marks a shift from using what nature provides directly to selecting among what nature provides. And selection implies judgment. Selection implies choice. Selection implies the beginning of intention. But the world of our early ancestors is slowly beginning to shift under their feet. The climate continues its long oscillation. Forests are giving way to grasslands. The animals available to hunt and scavenge are changing, and with tools that allow them to process food more efficiently, with the ability to access previously unavailable resources like bone marrow and tough sinew, our ancestors' population begins to grow. More individuals means more opportunities for learning and innovation. It means more chances for new techniques to be discovered and disseminated. But all of this is still to come. In this moment of first striking stone against stone, in this moment when a conscious being deliberately changes the world around it for the first time, something unprecedented has happened. A new force has entered the story of Earth's evolution. It is not biological force, though it is driven by biological creatures. It is cultural force, the ability to accumulate, preserve and refine knowledge across generations. This force will accelerate and compound over the eons. It will eventually transform the planet. But for now, in these first moments, it is small and fragile. It exists only in a few minds in Africa. It could be lost. It could be forgotten. It could die out if a catastrophe strikes, if the social structures break down, if the knowledge fails to transmit to the next generation. But it won't be lost. It will persist, and it will grow. And from this first striking of stone against stone, there will eventually flow forth all of human civilization. That moment is coming. And when it arrives, everything will change. Let us now travel to a specific place and a specific moment, or at least as specific as we can make it when we're talking about events that occurred 2.6 million years ago. The place is called Gona, in the Afar region of Ethiopia. This is ancient land, carved by time and tectonic forces into a landscape of ravines and plateaus. Archaeologists working here have uncovered something extraordinary, a cache of stones that tell a story more eloquent than any written history. These stones are approximately 2.6 million years old. Among them are cores, larger stones from which smaller pieces have been deliberately struck. There are also flakes, the pieces that have been removed from these cores. The pattern of how these flakes were removed shows something remarkable. The person who struck these stones understood geometry. They understood angles. They understood how stone fractures. They knew that if you strike at a certain angle, with a certain force, using a certain striking tool, you get a certain result. When we look at these stones under magnification, we can see marks on them that tell us what they were used for. We can see traces of cutting on bone and hide. We can see evidence that these tools did the work they were made for. The tool maker did not just create something beautiful or random. They created something functional. They created something that solved a problem they faced in their daily life. This is the birth of what archaeologists call the Oldowan technology, or Mode 1 technology. The name Oldowan comes from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where these tools were first systematically discovered and studied by the legendary archaeologist Louis Leakey and his wife Mary in the 1930s. But we now know that even older examples exist at places like Gona and possibly at a site called Lamekwi, where tools dating back to 3.3 million years ago have been found, predating even the oldest old one by many hundreds of thousands of years. These first tools are simple by modern standards. There are no complex shapes or specialised forms. A typical Oldowan toolkit might include three main types. First, there are choppers, cores that have had flakes removed from one or more edges, creating a relatively sharp cutting surface. Second, there are the flakes themselves, the byproducts of creating the choppers, which actually turn out to be quite useful for precise cutting work. Third, there are hammerstones, rocks used to strike the cores and produce the flakes, but simple does not mean ineffective. When researchers have made replicas of these tools using the same techniques and materials, they have discovered that they work remarkably well. A sharp Oldowan flake can cut through hide. It can saw through bone. It can scrape meat from a carcass. In experiments where archaeologists have used replica Oldowan tools to butcher modern animals, they have found that they can process an entire animal efficiently with these simple tools. The psychological satisfaction of accomplishing a difficult task with an object you have deliberately created. This must have been enormous. Now, how exactly were these first tools made? The process is more subtle than one might think. The toolmaker does not simply smash one rock against another randomly. There is method to it. First, you select your raw material carefully. You want stone that will fracture in a predictable way. Certain types of stone work better than others. Basalt, quartz, quartzite. These are good choices. The stone must have the right internal structure, the right crystalline properties. Our ancestors somehow knew this, through observation and perhaps through trial and error, across many generations. Next, you must position the stone correctly. The way you hold the core stone, the stone you're going to be removing flakes from, matters enormously. You need to find natural or created platforms where striking at an angle will produce the desired fracture. This requires spatial understanding. You must be able to visualize inside the stone, to imagine where the fracture will travel before you strike. Then comes the strike. Using your hammerstone, another carefully selected piece of rock, you hit the core stone at a precise angle with a precise force. Too little force and nothing happens. Too much force and the stone shatters unpredictably. The force must be tuned. The angle must be right. And the toolmaker, through repetition and observation, learns to make these calculations instinctively. What results is a series of flakes, each with at least one sharp edge, where the fracture has separated the stone. These flakes are not crude despite their simplicity. The best ones are thin and keen. They can be held and used, and they remain sharp until they become dulled through use, at which point they are simply discarded and new ones are made. Here's what's remarkable about this process. It requires planning. It requires imagination. You must be able to see a stone and imagine what it could become. You must understand cause and effect. You must have the patience to perform precise motions repeatedly, refining your technique through each attempt. You must have the impulse to preserve solutions that work, to continue using the technique that produces the useful tools, rather than abandoning it for random alternatives. Think about the cognitive leap this represents. You are no longer just using what nature has given you. You are actively questioning it, reshaping it, making it into something more useful for your specific purposes. This is the birth of technology. This is the first time in Earth's history that a conscious being has looked at the world around it and thought, this could be different, this could be better, and I am capable of making that change. The tool makers themselves, Who are they? This is still being debated among archaeologists and paleontologists. The earliest tools predate the genus Homo, so the makers might be Australopithecines, creatures like Australopithecus gahi or Paranthropus, our evolutionary cousins, rather than our direct ancestors. By the time we reach the fuller Oldowan tradition, around 2.5 to 1.7 million years ago, Homo habilis, handyman, is definitely on the scene, and these tools are certainly associated with early members of our genus. But here's an important realization. Whoever the first tool makers were, they did not suddenly become different creatures. They did not undergo some miraculous transformation. They simply began doing something new, with capabilities they already possessed. The brains that could imagine and plan the creation of tools were not dramatically larger than those of their relatives. The hands were not radically different. What was different was the decision to apply existing capabilities in new ways. What was different was the willingness to try something, to fail, to try again, to succeed. This is a reminder that revolutionary change often does not require radical new abilities. It requires the application of existing abilities in novel directions. It requires curiosity, experimentation, patience, and the capacity to teach others what you have learned. Imagine the first successful toolmaker. Perhaps they have spent time watching stones break naturally. Perhaps they've noticed that flakes with sharp edges are created in the process. Perhaps one day they deliberately try to create these flakes by striking a stone. Maybe the first attempt fails, but they try again. And this time a flake breaks free, sharp and ready. Maybe it takes them a few hours or a few days, but they get there. They create a tool. What must they feel? There must be a sense of accomplishment, of having solved a problem. When they use this tool successfully, when they are able to cut through something that was previously difficult to cut, there must be a spark of understanding. They have created something that extends their capability. They have made themselves stronger, more capable, more able to deal with the challenges of their world. And if they are part of a social group, which they certainly are, then others watch. They see what their companion has done. They see the result. They want to know how to do it too. And in that moment of curiosity and instruction, a crucial threshold is crossed. The knowledge has been transmitted. It will persist in the young maker's mind and hands. It will be used and refined. It will eventually be taught to others. The chain of cultural transmission continues unbroken. This scenario is speculative, but it is based on evidence. It represents the kind of teaching that must have occurred for Oldowan tool-making techniques to persist and improve across hundreds of thousands of years and across vast geographic areas. The fact that similar tools are made in similar ways at sites separated by thousands of kilometres and thousands of years strongly suggests that knowledge was deliberately being communicated, preserved and maintained across generations and across communities. There is evidence from modern anthropology and ethnography that suggests how this transmission might have worked. In recent centuries, when anthropologists have documented traditional peoples with tool-making practices, they have observed that knowledge is passed from generation to generation through a combination of observation, play, practice, and eventual participation in productive work. Young individuals begin by watching. Then they practice with toy versions or simplified versions of tools. Gradually, through a process of trial and error, guided by more experienced individuals, they become competent. Eventually, they become skilled enough to contribute meaningfully to the group's productive activities. We should probably imagine that something similar occurred in early hominin groups. Young individuals would have watched tool making from an early age. They would have played with stones, experimenting with striking motions and understanding which stones break how. As they grew and gained strength and dexterity, they would begin to make simple tools under guidance. Eventually, they would become proficient and would contribute to the group's tool-making activities. As they aged and gained more knowledge and skill, they would become teachers themselves, passing on what they had learned to the next generation. The implications of this teaching and learning process are profound. It means that tool-making was not just a behaviour, but a profession of sorts, a specialised knowledge that required years to master. It means that individuals who were skilled at making tools would have had social value. Their knowledge would be sought. They would be respected. They might have had some say in group decisions. The emergence of specialised knowledge and the specialists who possessed it is an important step in the development of human society. There is another crucial implication. The emergence of teaching creates the possibility of cumulative cultural evolution. When knowledge is passed on accurately from generation to generation, improvements and innovations can accumulate. An individual might make a small improvement to a tool-making technique. This improvement is more effective, more efficient, or produces better tools. When this individual teaches others, the improvement is maintained. The next generation, starting from this improved baseline, might make their own innovations. Over time, the accumulation of innovations leads to significant changes in the technology. This process of cumulative cultural evolution is one of the defining characteristics of humanity. It is why human culture can change so rapidly compared to the biological evolution of other animals. Biological evolution depends on genetic inheritance and is limited by the rate at which mutations occur and spread through a population. Cultural evolution depends on learning and teaching and can spread much more rapidly. An innovation made by one individual can, within the lifetime of their teachers and students, spread to multiple groups and become the standard practice. The evidence suggests that this cumulative cultural evolution was happening even in the Oldowan period. The tools made at the end of the Oldowan period show more sophistication, more control, more refinement than those made at the beginning. This improvement happened over nearly 1 million years, not overnight, but it happened. It is evidence of knowledge being preserved, refined, improved, and transmitted across vast spans of time. We should recognise that this process of teaching and cumulative cultural evolution represented a fundamental shift in how information is organised and preserved in the world. Before tool-making culture, information about how to live and survive was encoded in genes and instincts. It changed slowly, on the timescale of biological evolution. With the emergence of teaching and cultural transmission, information could be stored in minds and in the practices of communities. It could change much more rapidly. It could be modified and improved intentionally, not just through the blind forces of natural selection. This is the birth of what we might call culture in the fullest sense, not just behaviour or practices, but knowledge that is preserved and transmitted, valued and refined. It is the beginning of the process that would eventually lead to all of human civilization, all of human knowledge, all of human achievement. It begins with someone teaching another how to strike a stone. Before we can truly understand the significance of these first tools, we must pause and consider the instrument that made them possible. We must talk about the human hand. So take a moment and look at your own hands. Look at them with fresh awareness. Perhaps cup them together, feeling the space inside. Run your thumb across the palm of the other hand. Feel the sensitivity there, the network of nerves that allows you to sense the world through your skin. The human hand is one of evolution's most remarkable creations. It is a masterpiece of engineering, refined through millions of years of natural selection and adaptation. When we look at the hands of our early ancestors, preserved in the fossil record, and when we compare them to the hands of modern humans and our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and other great apes, we can trace a story of evolutionary refinement that is intimately tied to tool making. Let's start with what makes the human hand special compared to other primates. The most obvious feature is the thumb. In humans, the thumb is relatively long and robust compared to the fingers. In our evolutionary cousins, the chimpanzees and gorillas, the thumb is shorter and positioned differently. This difference is not trivial. The length and positioning of the human thumb enables something called a precision grip, the ability to oppose the thumb pad directly against the pads of the other fingers. You're using a precision grip right now if you're holding anything delicate, a pen, a pencil, the device you might be reading this on. There is something called a power grip as well, where multiple fingers wrap around an object and the thumb applies lateral pressure. Your hand can do both, and the ability to switch between these two types of grips is part of what makes the human hand so versatile. You can hold a fragile egg in a precision grip without crushing it. You can swing an axe with a power grip, applying tremendous force. Few other animals can do both equally well, but the architecture of the hand goes deeper than just thumb length. The bones of the human hand are structured differently than those of apes. They are smaller, more refined, capable of delicate movements. The joints have different shapes and arrangements, allowing for a greater range of motion. The ligaments and tendons that move the fingers are arranged in a way that permits fine motor control. In an ape's hand, the fingers are somewhat locked into patterns of movement, designed for grasping and climbing. In the human hand, there is far greater independent control of each digit. What's truly remarkable is that all these anatomical features appear not just in modern humans, but in our fossil ancestors going back quite far. When paleontologists examine hand bones of Australopithecus sediba, a creature that lived roughly 1.98 million years ago, they find that despite this species not having a fully modern human body plan, the hand shows evidence of precision grip capabilities. The bones are arranged in ways that would have allowed for careful, delicate control of the fingers. Even more intriguing, when we examine the internal bone structure, the arrangement of trabeculae, the tiny supporting struts inside bone that respond to how force is applied, we find evidence that Australopithecus africanus was regularly using forceful precision grips. The internal structure of bone remodels over an organism's lifetime in response to how that bone is being used. It's as if the bone is recording the history of use, leaving traces of habits in its very structure. This suggests something profound. Our early ancestors were using their hands with precision and force in ways that required specialised bone structure long before they were making formal stone tools. Perhaps they were using tools made of materials that didn't preserve, sticks, bone, wooden objects. Perhaps they were manipulating food objects in ways that required fine control. We don't know exactly, but the evidence suggests that tool use using precision grips came before stone tools. The capability existed, and when circumstances aligned and when the cognitive capacity for intentional tool making emerged, the hands were already evolved to support it. Think about the muscles in your hand. Scientists have identified over 30 separate muscles that control hand movement, though not all of them are located within the hand itself. Some are in the forearm, controlling movement through tendons. In chimpanzees, while they have many of the same muscles, they are not as well developed. They do not have the same level of neural control. The human hand has literally more muscle tissue dedicated to fine motor control. This increased muscle mass and neural control required more brain space to manage. It required additional portions of the motor cortex to handle the increased complexity. But this raises an interesting question. Did the brain expand first and then the hands became more capable? Or did the hands become more capable, creating selective pressure for brains that could manage that increased capability? Or did they co-evolve together, each improvement in one driving improvements in the other? The archaeological record and the fossil record both suggest that it's complex. Stone tools appear in the record before we see evidence of dramatically enlarged brains, but the hands of early tool makers were already quite sophisticated. So perhaps what happened is this: our ancestors had hands that were already good at precise manipulation, left over from earlier adaptations to climbing and precise foraging. These hands made tool making possible. The cognitive capacity for tool making, which did not require enormous brains initially. The first tools are simple, drove selection for better brains to manage increasingly complex tool making techniques. And over millions of years, hands and brains co-evolved, each enhancing the other, creating the modern human hand and brain that we possess today. This co-evolution is not unique to humans, but the combination of forces is unique. The great apes have hands that are capable of some precision, but they live primarily in forested environments where climbing is important, so their hands maintain features optimized for arboreal life. Humans, by committing to upright walking and living increasingly on open ground, could afford to have hands that became increasingly specialised for manipulation rather than locomotion. What does this mean? It means that your hand is the product of a specific evolutionary path. It evolved for the world that your ancestors inhabited. It evolved for tool making and tool use. In a very real sense, your hand is a tool, fine-tuned over millions of years to grasp and manipulate other tools. When you pick up an object and use it to accomplish a task, you are engaging in behaviour that is written into the very structure of your body. Now, here's where this becomes even more interesting. We learn through our hands. A baby learns about the world by putting things in its mouth, by grasping and releasing, by manipulating objects. As the child grows, increasingly complex hand movements are learned and refined. The The brain adapts, building stronger neural pathways for movements that are practiced frequently. The hand and the brain continue to co-evolve throughout life. When you learn to play an instrument, or to draw, or to perform surgery, your brain is literally reorganizing itself to support these activities. The area of your brain devoted to fine motor control of your hands expands. This learning capacity was crucial for our ancestors. When they first learned to make stone tools, they had to learn the technique. They had to practice. They had to refine their hand movements through repetition. Over time and across generations, the techniques became more sophisticated. Hands became more practiced. Brains became better at managing these complex movements. And this feedback loop of learning and refinement and practice drove the evolution of both hand and brain in the direction of greater capability. So when we look at a fossil hand bone from our ancestor, we are not just looking at anatomy. We are looking at a record of behaviour. We are looking at evidence that this creature used its hands in ways that left physical traces. We are looking at the beginning of the story that led to your hands, which can write poetry and build cathedrals and paint masterpieces and perform surgeries. In many ways, the hand is the most profound symbol of what it means to be human. It is not our intelligence, though intelligence is important. It is not our language, though language would come later. It is the hand that grasps and shapes and creates, the hand that reaches out to another in friendship or comfort, the hand that writes and draws and makes music and builds structures. Before any of those things, the hand was the instrument of our survival. And in learning to use the hand to make tools, our ancestors unlocked something that no other creature had achieved. They unlocked the ability to intentionally reshape their world. When our ancestors struck stone against stone 2.6 million years ago, they were using hands shaped by millions of years of evolution, hands already specialised for precision and power. They were combining anatomy with ingenuity, hardware with software, and from that combination emerged something genuinely new in the universe, the first deliberate technology. So take a moment now and look at your hands again. Feel the weight of them, the sensitivity of the skin, the strength of the muscles beneath. Recognise them for what they are, the culmination of millions of years of evolution, refined through countless generations to do exactly what they can do. These hands are ancient. They carry in their structure the memory of African landscapes, of tools made and remade, of problems solved through ingenuity and practice. When you use your hands now, you are participating in a behaviour that stretches back to the beginning of human culture. You are doing what your ancestors learned to do millions of years ago, in a world that was unimaginably different from this one. Now we have all the pieces in place. We understand the landscape our ancestors inhabited. We understand the problems they faced. We understand the anatomy that made solution possible. We understand that the first strike of stone against stone was an act of intention and creativity. Now let us delve deeper into the technology itself, into the Oldowan tradition and what it reveals about the minds that created it. The Oldowan tradition spans roughly from 2.6 million years ago until about 1.7 million years ago, when a new tool technology begins to emerge. That's nearly 1 million years of relative stability in how stone tools were made and used. This is a remarkable testament to the effectiveness of the technology. When something works well, when it solves the problems it needs to solve, it persists. Evolution by natural selection favours what works. Culture, guided by the human minds that create and transmit it, also preserves what works. But this doesn't mean the Oldowan tradition remained completely static across the entire million years of its existence. Careful study of the toolkits found at different sites and different time periods reveals subtle changes and refinements. The tools made later in the tradition tend to show more control in the striking process. The flakes are more consistent in size and shape. The cores show more sophisticated selection of striking angles. Over time, the tool makers got better at their craft. They refined it. They passed on refined techniques to the next generation, who further refined them. This process of gradual improvement, maintained over hundreds of thousands of years, reveals something crucial about tool-making culture. It was not rigid. It was not unthinkingly repeated. The makers of these tools were observing their own work, noting what worked better and what worked worse, and adjusting their techniques accordingly. This is experimentation. This is the beginning of empirical science, not called by that name, conducted without written records or formal methodology, but still, at its heart, the systematic observation of cause and effect and the adjustment of behaviour based on what was observed. Let's examine the three primary tool types of the Oldowan more carefully, starting with the simpler and moving to more complex variations. The chopper is the most basic. It is a stone, usually roughly the size of a fist or slightly larger, from which one or more flakes have been removed from one or more edges, creating a sharp or relatively sharp surface. When you hold a chopper, you quickly understand what it's for. The sharp edge is where you focus your attention. You can use it to cut, to chop, to hack at materials that are softer than the stone itself. Early descriptions of the Oldowan by archaeologists emphasised choppers, which is why they sometimes called the entire technology tradition pebble tool culture. But as analysis became more sophisticated, it became clear that the choppers were only part of the story. The flake is the second major tool type, and ironically, it is often more useful than the chopper that generated it. When you strike a stone core to remove a flake, that flake has a naturally sharp edge along the place where it's separated from the core. This edge, in many cases, is actually sharper than the edge you can create on the chopper by removing flakes. Flakes can be quite thin, relatively light, easy to hold and manipulate. They are excellent for precise cutting work. Archaeological evidence shows that flakes were used to cut meat, to strip hide, to cut plant materials. The flakes represent a kind of unintentional refinement, a byproduct of making choppers that turned out to be very useful indeed. The third category is the hammerstone. These are the tools used to strike the cores and create the flakes and choppers. Hammerstones often show evidence of battering on one or more ends, signs of repeated striking. They are the crucial instrument in the tool-making process itself. Without the hammerstone, you cannot make the chopper or flakes. In a way, the hammerstone is the most fundamental tool, the tool that enables the making of tools. Some of the first true tool makers probably obtained their hammerstones from naturally occurring rocks they found suitable for the purpose. But eventually, there is evidence that hammerstones were also deliberately selected and sometimes modified to be better suited to their purpose. Beyond these three main categories, there are variations and specialisations that emerge, particularly later in the Oldowan tradition. Some tools seem to have been fashioned for specific purposes. Heavier stones for breaking bones to access marrow. Lighter stones for more delicate cutting work. Some sites show evidence of transport of raw materials over considerable distances, suggesting that tool makers travelled with their favourite stone types and used them in different locations. What raw materials were used? The choice depended on what was locally available. Oldowan tool makers were flexible and pragmatic. They would use what worked. Basalt, quartzite, quartz and other stone types appear in different proportions at different sites based on local geology. But the techniques remain consistent. This consistency suggests that the tool makers understood principles that transcended the specific materials. Principles about how stone fractures, about angles and force and positioning that worked regardless of the specific rock being used. When we examine Oldowan sites, we find something interesting about how the tools were distributed and used. Some sites seem to be places where tools were made. You find numerous cores and flakes and debris from the tool making process. Other sites seem to be places where tools were used. You find bones with cut marks, evidence of processing, but fewer of the discarded cores and flakes that would be created during manufacture. Some sites are both, places where food was processed and where tools were made and resharpened as needed. This diversity of site types suggests something important about the behaviour of early tool makers. They were mobile. They moved across landscapes. They selected places to camp or work based on resource availability. When they needed tools, they could make them, so they didn't necessarily need to transport heavy stone over long distances. Though there is evidence that they did sometimes carry preferred stone types with them, especially high quality material that worked particularly well. The nutritional impact of these tools was significant. Processing animal carcasses more efficiently meant that more individuals could be fed from a single kill. It meant that the energy cost of obtaining food decreased relative to the energy obtained from that food. This is called a return on investment in ecological terms. As soon as tool use became widespread enough to reduce this energy cost, we would expect that populations could grow larger, that more individuals could be supported in a given area. There is evidence of this in the archaeological record. Around the time that clear evidence of Oldowan toolmaking appears, we begin to see more evidence of hominin presence in the landscape. More sites, more tools, more bones with cut marks. This suggests population growth, which suggests that the technology was indeed providing an advantage that allowed more individuals to survive and reproduce. But the tools did more than just facilitate nutrition. They represented a category shift in how these creatures interacted with their world. They represented intentionality. They represented planning and foresight. They represented the ability to imagine something different than what currently existed and to make that imagination real. These cognitive capacities are profound. They are the roots of what we would eventually call consciousness, self-awareness, the ability to think about thinking. The making of Oldowan tools requires several cognitive capacities that we can identify and understand. First, there is goal-directed behaviour. The tool maker has a goal: to create a sharp edge. They are not randomly striking stones. Every strike is directed toward that goal. They assess whether they have achieved it and adjust their behaviour if they haven't. This requires working memory, the ability to hold the goal in mind while executing complex physical movements. Second, there is understanding of cause and effect. The toolmaker must understand that striking the stone at a certain angle will produce a certain result. This understanding might not be conscious or articulated, but it's present in the behaviour. It shows up as consistency and adjustments based on success and failure. It shows up as the ability to achieve a similar result multiple times. This understanding is the basis for all technology. Third, there is an implicit understanding of object properties. The toolmaker must be able to assess a stone and judge whether it will work for toolmaking. Different stones have different properties. Some are too brittle and shatter unpredictably. Some are too dense and don't fracture properly. Some have internal flaws that cause them to break in unexpected ways. Successful tool makers develop an intuitive understanding of these properties. They select stones that are likely to work. They adjust their technique based on the properties of the specific stone. Fourth, there is social learning and teaching. Tool-making knowledge had to be transmitted from experienced makers to learners. This required communication. It required the ability to guide another's behaviour. It required patience and repetition. It required the younger individual to have the cognitive capacity to understand what was being demonstrated and to practice until they could replicate it. All of this suggests that the makers of Oldowan tools had minds that were recognisably similar to ours in some fundamental ways. They were capable of conscious reflection on their own behaviour. They had the capacity for abstract thought, to imagine a tool before it existed. They had the capacity for social cooperation and knowledge transmission. They had curiosity about their world and the drive to improve their tools and techniques. One of the most fascinating questions about the Oldowan is this: what problems was it solving? We know that cut marks on bones found at Oldowan sites are consistent with stone tools being used to process carcasses. We know that the tools work well for cutting through hide and meat and bone. But was butchering the primary purpose of these tools, or was there something else? Recent research has suggested that another major use of early tools was processing plant materials. Seeds, tubers and other plant foods are nutritious but tough. Many require processing before they are easily edible. Stone tools could be used to crack seeds, to cut tubers, to make plant foods more accessible. The wear patterns on Oldowan tools show evidence of use on both animal and plant materials. Both were important to these early toolmakers. Access to bone marrow deserves special mention because of its importance. Bone marrow is rich in fat and calories, exactly what an omnivorous primate needs to fuel a relatively large brain. Without the ability to crack bones open to access the marrow, our ancestors would have had to rely on scavenging the nutritious brain tissue from animal carcasses left by predators, hoping the predators hadn't already eaten it. With tools that could crack bones, they could reliably access this high-value nutrition. This capability to access marrow might have been one of the primary drivers of Oldowan tool development. The sites where we find Oldowan tools and evidence of their use paint a picture of a life that is recognisable but alien. These are places where individuals came to process food, to make and maintain tools, to gather together. There is evidence of social behaviour. Multiple individuals using the same site, presumably cooperating, sharing information about the best places to hunt, the best techniques for processing. There is evidence of time depth, sites that were visited repeatedly over years or decades or centuries. Imagine yourself present at one of these sites, transported back 2.3 million years to a place like FLK Zinj in Oldowan Gorge. You arrive at a location near a water source, perhaps a stream or a river. The landscape is open grassland with scattered trees and shrubs. You see evidence of a kill, bones of an antelope or other prey animal, broken and scattered. You see stone cores and flakes, discarded after use, lying in the reddish soil. You see marks on the bones where sharp stone tools have scraped away meat and cracked the hard cortex to expose the nutrient-rich marrow. What you are witnessing is a moment frozen in time, preserved by the remarkable geological processes of Oldowan Gorge. This moment represents hours or days in the lives of early toolmakers. It represents the knowledge they had accumulated about which animals to hunt, how to process them, how to use the tools they had invented. It represents the beginning of the archaeological record, the beginning of evidence that we can dig up and examine thousands of millennia later. The Oldowan tradition lasted nearly 1 million years. That is an extraordinarily long time for a cultural practice to persist. For comparison, the Industrial Revolution has only been going on for a few hundred years, and we live in a world of rapid change. The Oldowan endured through climate shifts, through population changes, through the emergence and extinction of various hominin species. Its persistence speaks to how effective these tools were and how thoroughly the knowledge of their making had become embedded in hominin culture. Yet eventually, the old one gave way to a new technology. The reasons for this shift are not entirely clear, but around 1.7 million years ago, we see the emergence of a new type of tool, a new technology that would represent a significant advance in cognitive complexity and planning. The older one did not disappear all at once. Different tool traditions sometimes overlapped, coexisted, even combined elements. But gradually, something new was becoming the dominant way of making stone tools. To fully understand the significance of these first tools, we must move beyond the stones themselves and try to reconstruct the lives of the people who made and used them. This is where archaeology becomes particularly challenging, because it requires us to interpret fragmentary evidence and imagine scenes that happened millions of years ago. Yet the evidence, when carefully examined, tells stories that are surprisingly vivid and emotionally resonant. Oldowan Gorge in Tanzania has provided some of the most detailed windows into early hominin life. The gorge is a natural archive where ancient layers are exposed to view, each layer separated by volcanic ash that can be precisely dated. Different occupational levels, different moments in time separated by thousands of years, appear as distinct strata. When archaeologists excavate carefully, they can reconstruct not just what tools were present, but how they were arranged, what other materials were associated with them, what activities took place. One of the most famous sites is called FLK Zinj, the initial stand for the scientists' names, and Zinj is an archaic name for East Africa. Here, at a level dating to about 1.8 million years ago, archaeologists found extensive evidence of tool making and food processing. The site is not large, perhaps 15 or 20 metres across, but it is densely packed with evidence of activity. There are hundreds of stone tools or fragments of tools. There are bones with cut marks. There is debris from the manufacturing process, small stone chips that flew off when tools were being made. What does this tell us? It tells us that this was a place where individuals came repeatedly to do work. It was probably not a permanent dwelling. Early hominins were probably mobile, moving following food sources seasonally. But it was a place that had some significance, a place that attracted repeated visitation. Perhaps it was near a reliable water source. Perhaps it was near a location where dead animals could be scavenged. Perhaps it was simply a good place to work with stone. When we look at the bone evidence at these sites, we see patterns that suggest hunting and butchering, but also scavenging. There is evidence of cut marks, indicating that tools were used to process the animals. But there is also evidence that predators and other carnivores had been at the bones first. The pattern of what was eaten and what was left suggests that early hominins were opportunistic. When they could kill or find a carcass fresh, they would exploit it fully. When they came to a kill that other predators had already worked on, they would salvage what they could, particularly the bones that could be cracked open for marrow. This was not a world of abundance. Resources were scattered, unreliable, hard-won. Every successful kill or successful scavenging event was significant. Every bit of nutrition extracted from an animal carcass was precious. The tools that allowed more efficient processing of these resources, the stones that could crack bone and cut hide, were genuinely valuable. They extended capability. They made survival more likely. How many individuals were present at these sites at any given time? The evidence suggests small groups. Looking at the pattern of tool use and the distribution of tools and bones, most archaeologists estimate that Oldowan sites represent the work of small social groups, perhaps 5 to 15 individuals, sometimes more. These might be family groups or extended kinship networks. They are definitely social units that stayed together for extended periods. The social structure of these groups is largely unknowable from the archaeological record alone. We can't see hierarchy or cooperation or conflict directly, but we can make some inferences. The fact that tool-making techniques were similar across sites, separated by large distances, suggests that there was contact between groups, movement of individuals between groups, sharing of knowledge. This implies some level of social organisation and communication beyond what we might expect in simple family units. There is also evidence of cooperation. Some of the animals found at Oldowan sites are large enough that a single individual would have had difficulty killing them. Processing a large animal, butchering it and carrying away the meat would be much easier with multiple individuals. The evidence suggests that hunting and butchering were group activities. They required coordination. They required individuals to work together toward a common goal. This cooperative behaviour is one of the hallmarks of human social organisation. What did these individuals look like? By the time of the sites we're discussing, Homo habilis was present, along with perhaps other hominin species. Homo habilis was smaller than modern humans, males averaging around 1.3 metres tall and weighing perhaps 40 to 50 kilograms. Females were likely smaller still. They were bipedal, but not perfectly adapted to upright walking the way modern humans are. Their arms were relatively longer, their legs shorter. They probably spent some time in trees, sleeping in branches at night to avoid predators. But they were fundamentally terrestrial creatures, spending most of their time on the ground. Their brains were larger than those of Australopithecus, but smaller than modern human brains. The endocasts, impressions of the inside of fossil skulls that reveal the shape and size of brains, show that while the overall volume was less than ours, the organisation of the brain showed some distinctly human-like features. The areas associated with fine motor control and speech were already showing expansion. What were their diets like? The evidence suggests that they were omnivorous, eating both plant and animal foods. The proportions of each would have varied with season and availability. In some seasons, plant foods like seeds, tubers, fruits and leaves would have been primary. In other seasons, when animals could be hunted or scavenged, meat would have been more important. This dietary flexibility is one of the characteristics that allowed early humans to survive in diverse environments. What about shelter? Early hominins probably did not build elaborate structures. There is some evidence of simple arrangements of stone at certain sites, patterns that might suggest windbreaks or basic shelters, but nothing that would compare to human dwellings. Most likely, they slept in trees or in rock shelters when available. They probably spent time at particular sites, at least temporarily, because of resource availability. Particular locations might have been occupied repeatedly across years because they offered advantages like proximity to water or good stone for tool making. Fire is a crucial question. By the time we're talking about 2.5 to 1.7 million years ago, is there evidence of fire use? The answer is genuinely uncertain and remains debated among scholars. Some researchers point to possible evidence of fire at sites like Kubifora in Kenya, dating to around 1.5 million years ago, but these remains could potentially have resulted from natural wildfires. The most widely accepted evidence for controlled fire use by Homo erectus comes from sites like Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa, where microscopic traces of burned plant material and bone date to approximately 1 million years ago. This means that for most of the Oldowan period and much of the early Acheulean, we should probably imagine that our ancestors did not have fire yet. They ate their food raw. They faced the cold of African nights without warmth from flames. Fire would come later and would be revolutionary, but for now, these early tool makers lived in a world of the raw and uncooked. What did their days look like? Imagine you were a member of a small group of Homo habilis living in the African landscape 2 million years ago. You wake before dawn, perhaps in a tree where your group has sheltered for the night, safe from the larger predators that hunt in darkness. As the light returns, you climb down and rejoin the group. Perhaps there is some vocalization, some communication between individuals about plans for the day. The morning is spent searching for food. This might mean walking across the grassland looking for signs of animals that can be hunted or recently killed by predators. It might mean gathering plant foods, fruits, seeds, tubers that you know from experience are edible. You use your hands and your senses, your eyes to spot objects, your nose to smell potentially dangerous predators or decomposing carcasses, your ears to listen for sounds of larger animals. Around midday, you might come across something valuable, perhaps a carcass that a lion or a hyena has recently abandoned. The predators might still be nearby. So there is danger, but there is also opportunity. Your group gathers the stones that you carry with you, stones that you selected because they work well for tool making. Using techniques learned through years of practice, you strike flakes from cores. You create sharp edges. You use these tools to cut into the carcass, to strip meat from bone, to crack open bones to access the marrow. This work takes time and effort, but it is productive. You extract nutrients that will sustain your group for days. Late in the day, as the sun moves lower, you prepare to return to your shelter. If your site is productive, if it has good stone for tool making and good access to water and food, you might stay here for several days or weeks. You make camp, perhaps moving into a rock shelter if one is available, or preparing a simple shelter if not. You arrange your tools and materials around the site, creating a kind of organised living space. As darkness falls, you and your group settle in together. There is warmth from other bodies. There is safety in numbers. There is communication, vocalizations, gestures, expressions that convey information and emotion. This is not comfort as a modern human would understand it, but it is not misery either. It is a life adapted to its environment. It is a life of challenge and satisfaction. There is satisfaction in solving problems, in finding food, in making tools that work, in successfully processing a carcass. There is social satisfaction in belonging to a group, in cooperating with others, in passing knowledge to younger members. The tools are not just utilitarian objects. They represent knowledge, skill, understanding. When you make a tool well, when you create a sharp flake that works effectively, there is something that might be called pride. When you teach another individual how to make a tool, and they succeed, there is something that might be called satisfaction. These emotional dimensions of tool-making culture are not visible in the archaeological record, but they are likely real and significant. Over the course of thousands of years, the techniques for making tools improved slightly. The understanding of stone properties and tool design became more refined. Different individuals and groups experimented, tried new approaches, kept what worked, and abandoned what didn't. This was cultural evolution, not biological evolution, but evolution nonetheless. Over vast spans of time, with no written records and no formal science, the knowledge accumulated and improved. Now we arrive at the most profound question. What was actually happening in the minds of these early tool makers? What cognitive capacities did they possess? To what extent were they conscious in the way we are conscious? These are questions that cannot be definitively answered from the fossil record, but we can make informed inferences based on the tools themselves and the behaviour they demonstrate. When we talk about consciousness, we are really talking about several related but distinct phenomena. There is basic awareness, the ability to perceive the environment and respond to it. All animals have this to some degree. A fish can perceive light and darkness, food and danger. But consciousness, as we typically experience it, includes more than this. It includes self-awareness, the ability to know that you are distinct from others and from the environment. It includes the ability to imagine things that do not currently exist. It includes the ability to reflect on your own thoughts and behaviours. It includes emotions and the awareness of emotions. It includes the capacity for planning and foresight. Which of these capacities did the makers of Oldowan tools possess? The tools themselves suggest that they had substantial consciousness in several of these domains. The fact that they could select stones based on properties and use them to make other tools suggests an understanding of object properties and cause and effect. The fact that they made similar tools repeatedly in consistent ways suggests that they had some mental template, an idea in their mind of what they were trying to create, that they tried to realise in stone. But perhaps the most telling evidence of consciousness is the evidence of teaching and learning. The persistence and consistency of Oldowan tool-making techniques across hundreds of thousands of years and across vast geographic distances suggests that knowledge was being carefully transmitted from one generation to the next. This requires that the maker of tools be conscious enough to understand that others can learn, to be intentionally showing them how to do something, to be correcting when they do it wrong. This level of conscious intentionality is significant. It suggests that these creatures understood the minds of others, that they had a theory of mind, as cognitive scientists would say. Theory of mind is the ability to understand that other beings have minds, thoughts, desires and knowledge that might be different from your own. It's the ability to imagine what another creature is thinking or feeling. Without this capacity, you cannot deliberately teach. You can demonstrate behaviour, but you cannot explain it or intend to communicate understanding. The evidence of teaching in tool-making culture strongly suggests that early hominins possessed theory of mind. What about language? Did Oldowan tool makers have language as we understand it? This is genuinely uncertain. The anatomical evidence is mixed. The larynx, the voice box, does not fossilise, so we cannot know for certain whether their vocal apparatus was capable of producing human speech. However, some anthropologists have argued that the anatomy of the vocal tract in creatures like Homo habilis might have allowed for speech. Other anthropologists are more sceptical, but here is an important realisation. Full language with complex grammar might not have been necessary for teaching tool-making. You can teach by demonstration. You can show someone the striking motion, the angle, the force. You can guide their hand into the right position. You can make vocalizations to indicate approval or disapproval. You can create associations between specific sounds and specific objects or actions. This is proto-language perhaps, or gestural language, or something we have no good name for, because it existed so long ago and left no direct record. Over time though, the need to communicate increasingly complex ideas would have created selection pressure for better communication systems. As tool making became more complex, as social groups became more sophisticated, as the knowledge to be transmitted became more detailed, the need for precise communication would have grown. This would eventually drive the evolution of language, true language with grammar and vocabulary, and the capacity for displaced reference, the ability to talk about things not present, or things in the past or future. But we should be careful not to project modern human consciousness onto creatures who lived millions of years ago. They were conscious, thinking beings, capable of learning and teaching and problem solving. But their consciousness was probably different from ours in important ways. They probably did not engage in abstract philosophical reflection. They probably did not tell stories with complex narrative structures. They probably did not have elaborate theories about how the world works. Their consciousness was probably more focused on the present, more tied to immediate experience and practical problem solving. Yet there is evidence that might suggest the beginnings of abstract thought. If a tool maker was making tools not for immediate use, but anticipating future need, making tools today to use tomorrow or next week, this would suggest the capacity for planning and foresight that goes beyond pure instinct. Some Oldowan sites show evidence of accumulation of tools, suggesting that they were being stored for future use. This indicates thinking ahead, preparing for contingencies. There is another fascinating question. Did tool makers take aesthetic pleasure in their work, or was everything purely utilitarian? This is impossible to answer directly, but there are hints. Some Oldowan tools are more carefully made than strictly necessary for function. The stone is nicely shaped, the flaking is controlled and symmetrical. One might argue that this represents aesthetics, that the maker cared about how the tool looked, not just how it functioned. Or one might argue that it's simply the result of more skilled practice, that with experience the maker naturally produced tools that were more elegant and efficient. But here's what we do know. By later periods in hominin evolution, there is clear evidence of aesthetic and symbolic behaviour. Decorative objects, pigmented stones, signs of what might be called art, appear in the archaeological record. These aesthetic behaviours likely have their roots in the earlier period we are discussing, the capacity for symbolic thought, for caring about aesthetics, for creating things that have meaning beyond their utilitarian function. This capacity was developing even in the Oldowan period, even if we don't see the fullest expression of it in the archaeological record. Another crucial cognitive capacity that tool making demonstrates is the ability to understand abstractions. A tool is, in a sense, an abstract concept made concrete. The idea of an object with a sharp edge useful for cutting is abstract. The specific stone tool is the concrete instantiation of that abstract idea. When tool makers deliberately created tools according to a mental template, an abstract blueprint in their minds, they were engaging in abstract thought. This is not the abstract thought of a mathematician or philosopher, but it is genuine abstraction nonetheless. Over the course of the Oldowan period, we can trace the development of more sophisticated cognitive abilities. The tools become more refined. The understanding of stone properties becomes more sophisticated. The planning and organisation of tool making becomes more evident. This suggests that cognitive evolution was happening alongside cultural evolution. The minds of tool makers were becoming more capable, more refined, better able to handle complexity and abstraction. This cognitive evolution would eventually lead to the emergence of larger-brained Homo erectus, and eventually to modern humans. But we should recognise that the evolution of cognitive capacity happened gradually, almost imperceptibly, over vast spans of time. There was no sudden awakening, no magical moment when consciousness switched on. Rather, there was a gradual accumulation of cognitive capacities, each one building on what came before. Tool making was both a cause and an effect of this cognitive evolution. Creating tools drove selection for better brains. Better brains allowed for more sophisticated tools. The feedback loop accelerated the pace of change. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of early tool-making culture is that it was not static. The knowledge did not simply persist, unchanged, across millennia. It was elaborated, refined, improved. This improvement only happens if knowledge is being actively transmitted, and if the individuals transmitting it have some flexibility to innovate and experiment. How exactly was tool-making knowledge transmitted? We don't have direct evidence of teaching, but we have indirect evidence from the consistency and improvement of the tools over time. Different theories have been proposed about what the teaching process might have looked like. One model proposed by some researchers is the cognitive ratchet model. This suggests that when an individual discovers a new or improved technique, the knowledge is preserved not in their own mind, which will die when they die, but in the cultural tradition. When others learn from that individual, either through observation or through explicit instruction, they gain access to that innovation. If they continue to use it, the innovation is preserved. If they improve upon it, the improvement is also preserved and transmitted. Over thousands of years, the accumulation of small innovations and improvements leads to significant advances in the technology. Another model emphasizes the role of high-fidelity imitation. Young individuals watch skilled tool makers and carefully imitate their actions. This is not mindless copying. It requires attention, focus, and the ability to break down complex actions into components and reproduce them accurately. Studies of modern humans learning complex skills suggest that this kind of observational learning can transmit surprisingly detailed and subtle knowledge. A third model, proposed by various anthropologists, suggests that the transmission involved more explicit communication than pure imitation. Perhaps the skilled toolmaker would explain what they were doing through gesture and vocalization, guiding the learner's attention to key aspects of the process. Perhaps there was hands-on guidance where the teacher would physically position the learner's hands in the correct way. Perhaps there was correction where the teacher would indicate when the learner was doing something wrong and show them the right way. All of these elements might have been involved in the teaching process. What's crucial to understand is that teaching itself is a cognitive accomplishment. The person doing the teaching must have a theory of mind. They must understand that the learner has knowledge and skills that are different from their own, and that these can be improved through instruction. They must be capable of breaking down complex behaviours into teachable components. They must have the patience to work with learners who make mistakes. They must care about whether the knowledge is transmitted accurately. This level of intentional teaching is not something we see clearly in other animals. We see learning in other animals. Young animals learn from their parents and from others in their group. But systematic, intentional teaching aimed at transmitting cultural knowledge appears to be rare in the animal kingdom and may be virtually unique to humans. Its presence in the fossil record, evidenced by the transmission of tool-making techniques, tells us something profound about the nature of early human consciousness. Consider a scenario. A young individual, perhaps a teenager by modern standards, is learning to make stone tools. They watch a skilled maker strike a stone. They try to imitate the motion, but the angle is wrong, or the force is too great, and the result is not what they intended. The flake that comes off is the wrong shape, too thick or too thin or broken in the wrong place. The young maker looks frustrated or confused. The skilled maker recognises this. They step in. They reposition the young maker's hands. They show the proper grip. They might even guide the striking motion, moving the young maker's arm through the correct arc and force application. Like this, they might vocalize, using sounds that communicate approval or instruction. The young maker tries again, and this time the result is better. The flake is sharper, more useful. There is a feeling of satisfaction in both the teacher and the learner. Our journey through tool-making history now reaches a pivotal moment. A moment when the steady refinement of the Oldowan gave way to something distinctly new. Around 1.7 to 1.5 million years ago, we begin to see the emergence of a new tool technology in the archaeological record. This technology is called the Acheulean, named after a site near the town of Saint-Acheulean in France, where these distinctive tools were first identified in the 19th century. The hallmark of the Acheulean is the handaxe. The handaxe is a tool that represents a significant cognitive advance over the simple Oldowan choppers and flakes. A handaxe is typically a large piece of stone, worked on both faces to create a sharp cutting edge that runs around much of the perimeter of the tool. The result is a roughly symmetrical, pointed or rounded tool that fits comfortably in the hand. It is substantially larger than Oldowan tools, often 10 to 20 centimetres long, and represents a significant investment of time and skill in its manufacture. What makes the handaxe special? First, there is the symmetry. A good handaxe, viewed from above, is roughly symmetrical along its long axis. Creating this symmetry requires significant planning. The toolmaker must hold a mental image of the final form and work toward achieving it. They must assess the stone and plan their strikes accordingly. They must understand how their strikes affect the stone and adjust their subsequent strikes based on the results of previous ones. This level of planning and forethought represents an advance over the simpler Oldowan techniques. Second, there is the sheer amount of controlled flaking required. Making a handaxe involves removing dozens of flakes from the core, each strike precisely positioned to achieve the desired shape. This requires immense skill and incredible hand-eye coordination. Archaeological experiments in making replica handaxes have shown that achieving proficiency takes years of practice. Only individuals with substantial training and experience can create handaxes that match the quality of those found in the archaeological record. Third, the handaxe is multi-purpose. It can be used for cutting, for chopping, for butchering large animals. It can be used on hide, on muscle, on bone. Unlike the simpler Oldowan tools, which are often quite specialised, a particular chopper for a particular task, the handaxe is flexible. It can handle many different jobs. This flexibility gave early humans a more powerful tool for dealing with the challenges of their environment. The Acheulean tradition spans an enormous period of time, roughly from 1.7 to 0.1 million years ago. That's 1.6 million years. Over this vast expanse of time, the tradition shows gradual evolution and refinement. Early handaxes are cruder, with less symmetry and control. Later handaxes are more refined, more elegant, showing greater control and planning. By the late Acheulean, we see handaxes of extraordinary beauty, symmetrical, razor sharp, clearly the products of skilled craftspeople with decades of experience. Over the course of the Acheulean, we also see the emergence of other tool types. In addition to handaxes, there are cleavers, like handaxes but with a straighter cutting edge. Picks, thicker and more blunt for breaking bone or digging, and various scraping and cutting implements. This increasing diversity of tool types suggests that the makers were becoming more specialised, creating specific tools for specific purposes, rather than using multi-purpose implements for everything. Who were the makers of Acheulean tools? By this time, Homo erectus had emerged and spread across Africa and into Eurasia. Homo erectus is notably larger than Homo habilis, with brains that are bigger and organised differently. The fossil record suggests that Homo erectus was a capable, successful species that persisted for over 1 million years and eventually gave rise to later hominin species, including possibly Homo heidelbergensis. It was likely Homo erectus, or possibly also other species such as later Australopithecus or Paranthropus in some regions, that made at least some of the early Acheulean tools. The emergence of the handaxe and the broader Acheulean technology raises fascinating questions about cognition. What cognitive changes enabled this advance? One possibility is that there was actual brain evolution, that brains became larger and better organised over the approximately 800,000 to 1 million years between the latest Oldowan and the earliest Acheulean. There is evidence for this. Homo erectus brains are larger than those of Homo habilis. Homo erectus skulls show evidence of increased areas devoted to planning and motor control. The emergence of the handaxe and the broader Acheulean technology raises fascinating questions about cognition. What cognitive changes enabled this advance? One possibility is that there was actual brain evolution, that brains became larger and better organised over the approximately 800,000 to 1 million years between the latest Oldowan and the earliest Acheulean. There is evidence for this. Homo erectus brains are larger than those of Homo habilis. Homo erectus skulls show evidence of increased areas devoted to planning and motor control, but brain evolution alone doesn't explain the advance. There is also cultural evolution, the accumulation and transmission of knowledge about toolmaking. Perhaps at some point, an innovative individual experimented with a new approach to stone tool manufacturing. Instead of simply removing flakes from one side of a stone, they deliberately worked both sides, creating a more complex and controlled result. This innovation, if it proved effective, would be preserved and transmitted. Over many generations, others would build on it, refining the technique, improving the tools. What started as an experiment by an innovative individual would become the standard practice. There may also have been environmental pressures driving this change. During the early Acheulean period, the climate in Africa was becoming drier and more seasonal. Grasslands were expanding. The prey animals available were changing. Perhaps hunting strategies needed to become more sophisticated, requiring more specialised tools. Perhaps the need to process larger animals more efficiently drove the development of more powerful, more versatile tools like handaxes. Whatever the drivers, the result was that tool making became more complex and more sophisticated. The handaxe is not just a tool, it is a symbol of something changing in the minds of its makers. It is evidence of planning, of aesthetic sense, of skilled execution. Some scholars have argued that the emergence of the handaxe represents the dawn of art, that the symmetry and beauty of a well-made handaxe suggests that its maker cared about aesthetics, not just function. While it is hard to know whether art, in the sense of creation for its own sake, was part of handaxe production, we can say that handaxe makers clearly had some appreciation for form and symmetry. The distribution of Acheulean tools across the landscape tells an interesting story. Unlike the Oldowan, which is found primarily in Africa, Acheulean tools appear across Africa and also in Western Asia and Europe. This suggests that populations carrying this technology spread out of Africa and successfully colonised new environments. The ability to make sophisticated tools like handaxes gave them an advantage in adapting to diverse environments. Handaxes found in the Middle East and Europe show that early humans with this technology were capable of surviving and thriving in climates quite different from the African savanna, where the technology originated. One of the most famous Acheulean sites is Oldowan in Kenya, where excavations have revealed thousands of handaxes and other tools, along with evidence of large-scale hunting. The density of tools and the evidence of systematic hunting suggests that this site was occupied repeatedly over extended periods and that organised hunting was taking place. This represents a level of social organisation and planning that is more complex than what we see in Oldowan sites. Hunters had to coordinate with each other, had to plan attacks on large game, had to manage the processing of kills and distribution of meat among the group. The late Acheulean period, which extends from perhaps 400,000 years ago to 100,000 or even 50,000 years ago, exact dates vary by region, shows further sophistication. Some Acheulean tools from this period are extraordinarily beautiful. They are made on large flakes struck from enormous cores, and they show such fine control and symmetry that they must represent the work of master craftspeople. Some of these tools may never have been used. They may have been prized for their beauty or their demonstration of the maker's skill, kept and stored rather than used until they were damaged or lost. The end of the Acheulean is an interesting story in itself. In some parts of the world, like Africa, the Acheulean persisted for a very long time, eventually evolving into other tool traditions. In other parts, like Europe and the Middle East, the Acheulean eventually gave way to different tool technologies. The reasons for these regional variations are not entirely clear, but they likely reflect both cultural traditions and adaptation to different environments and prey animals. By the time the Acheulean tradition was well established, our ancestors had begun one of the most remarkable journeys in the history of life on Earth, the colonization of the entire world. This was not a sudden explosion of expansion. It happened gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years, but the result was that humans, carrying their tools and their knowledge, eventually spread to every continent except Antarctica. The evidence for this spread comes from tool sites discovered across Asia, Europe, and eventually beyond. In Java, in what is now Indonesia, Acheulean-like tools have been found associated with Homo erectus fossils dating back over 1 million years. In China, tool technologies emerged that, while not identical to African Acheulean tools, show similar principles and complexity. In Europe, Acheulean tools appear in the archaeological record, with some of the earliest dating to roughly 1 million years ago in southern Europe. What drove this expansion? Partly, it was probably population growth. As tool-making technologies improved and humans became more efficient at extracting nutrition from their environment, population grew. As populations grew, groups would have split off and moved to new territories. Partly, it was probably driven by climate shifts. As environments changed, groups that had adapted to particular conditions might have had to move to find suitable habitats. Partly, it was probably driven by the same curiosity and exploratory impulse that has always characterized human nature. The colonization of new environments required not just tools, but cultural knowledge about how to survive in those environments. When humans moved into new climates, they had to learn new plants and animals, new water sources, new dangers. This knowledge had to be accumulated through trial and error, through careful observation, through a process of learning what worked and what didn't. The process must have been difficult, fraught with failures and successes, but gradually humans adapted. Regional variations in toolmaking began to appear as different hominin populations adapted to different environments. In Africa, tool traditions continue to evolve along particular lines. In Asia, different technologies emerged. In Europe, Neanderthals would eventually develop their own sophisticated tools and practices. While the basic principles of stone toolmaking were shared, understanding stone properties, how it fractures, how to create sharp edges, the specific techniques and tool types varied based on local stone availability, local prey animals, and local cultural traditions. What does this tell us about the transmission of toolmaking knowledge? It tells us that the knowledge was embedded in particular communities and transmitted through those communities across time. It was not static, but it was also not radically innovative at each generation. People generally followed the traditions they learned, but occasional innovators would introduce variations. Some of these variations would prove advantageous and would be preserved. Others would be abandoned. Over time, this process led to divergence, to different tool-making traditions in different regions. This divergence is actually a good sign of human cultural complexity. It suggests that tool-making was not purely utilitarian. If tools were only about function, we might expect that once an optimal design was achieved, all humans would use it. Instead, we see that different traditions persisted, that cultural identity became wrapped up in tool-making practices. A particular group's handaxes looked different from another group's handaxes, not because they functioned differently, but because that's how they did it. This suggests that tool-making was becoming part of cultural identity, part of what made a group distinctive and separate from other groups. The evidence from multiple continents shows that by the early Acheulean, our ancestors had already developed sophisticated strategies for hunting and gathering. They were using fire in some locations, though not universally yet. They were making more specialised tools. They were organising socially in ways that required planning and cooperation. They were capable of maintaining cultural traditions across many generations and across vast distances. Yet we should not imagine that this was a smooth, progressive march toward modern humanity. Different regions took different paths. Some lines of descent went extinct. Some lineages gave rise to new species. The human evolutionary tree was bushy, with multiple branches and dead ends. Homo erectus survived for over 1 million years before eventually giving rise to successor species like Homo neanderthalensis in Europe and the Middle East, and possibly Homo heidelbergensis in Africa, which was itself possibly ancestral to both Neanderthals and modern humans. The point is that tool-making technology was not a simple linear progression from simple to complex. It was a process of cultural evolution in different directions adapted to different circumstances, influenced by different innovations and choices made by different groups of people. Some traditions emphasizing certain tool types, others emphasizing different ones. Some regions seeing rapid innovation, others maintaining traditions with little change across vast spans of time. But what remained constant throughout this period was the fundamental importance of tools. Whether the tools were Oldowan or Acheulean or one of the many regional variations, they were the key to human survival and success. They extended human capability. They allowed humans to exploit resources that would otherwise have been inaccessible. They allowed humans to live in environments that would otherwise have been hostile. They were the engine of human expansion and adaptation. As we approach the end of our long journey through the world of early toolmaking, we arrive at a crucial question. What does this all mean? What is the legacy of these first technologies? What does the story of Oldowan choppers and Acheulean handaxes tell us about ourselves and about the world we have created? First and foremost, tool making reveals something fundamental about human nature. We are creatures driven to solve problems. We are creatures who cannot accept the world as it is if we can imagine how it could be better. We pick up a stone and ask, can this be different? Can this be more useful? This impulse, the impulse to improve, to innovate, to reshape the world to suit our needs, is central to what it means to be human. It drives us to this day. Every technology we have created, from the first stone tool to the smartphones we carry in our pockets, descends from that first impulse to take nature and remake it for our purposes. Second, tool making demonstrates the power of accumulated knowledge. No individual human is responsible for the accumulation of tool making knowledge across millions of years. It is the result of countless innovations by countless individuals, each making small improvements, each passing knowledge to the next generation. This accumulation of knowledge is the foundation of all human civilization. Everything we have built, our cities, our technologies, our sciences, rests on the foundation of the knowledge passed down through countless generations. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and before those giants were the first tool makers who learned the basic principle of preserving and transmitting knowledge. Third, tool making reveals something about human sociality. Tools are not made in isolation. They are made by individuals who are part of communities, and the knowledge of how to make tools is preserved through communities. Teaching and learning, the transmission of knowledge from one person to another. These are social acts. They require empathy, patience, and the willingness to help others. Tool-making culture is evidence that humans have been social cooperative beings since the beginning. We didn't only become social when we built cities and complex societies. We have always been creatures who learned from each other, taught each other, and worked together to solve problems. Fourth, the story of early tools teaches us something about the importance of small improvements and the long timescales of change. The hand axe did not appear overnight. It emerged gradually from the Oldowan tradition, a product of many small innovations accumulating over hundreds of thousands of years. We live in a world that values rapid change and dramatic innovations. But evolution, both biological and cultural, usually works through gradual accumulation. The Oldowan tradition persisted for nearly 1 million years, with relatively slow change. The Acheulean persisted for over 1 million years, also with gradual refinement. This teaches us that great achievements can emerge from small, incremental improvements maintained consistently over long periods. Fifth, tool making reveals the power of imagination. The tool makers had to imagine something that didn't yet exist. A stone shaped differently, a tool more useful than what nature had provided. This faculty of imagination, the ability to conceive of possibilities and work toward making them real, is one of the most distinctly human capacities. Every story we tell, every plan we make, every future we envision comes from this same faculty. Tool making was the first expression of human imagination in the archaeological record, but it would not be the last. It would eventually lead to art, to music, to literature, to science, to all the great achievements of human civilization. Sixth, the story of early tool making teaches us about adaptation and flexibility. As our ancestors spread into new environments, they adapted their tool making to the materials available, to the animals they hunted, to the challenges they faced. This adaptive flexibility is one of the reasons humans have been so successful. We do not rely on a single unchangeable strategy. We observe our environment, we learn what works, we adjust our approach. This same flexibility that allowed our ancestors to thrive in diverse African environments and eventually spread across the world remains part of our nature today. Looking at modern humans and our relationship with tools, we can see that the journey that began 2.6 million years ago in Africa has not ended. We have gone from stone tools to tools of iron and steel, to tools of plastic and silicon, to tools powered by electricity and information. Yet the fundamental pattern remains the same. We see a problem. We imagine a solution. We make a tool to solve it. We use that tool and we improve it. We teach others how to use it. The knowledge accumulates and is preserved. Every person reading or listening to this is participating in that ancient tradition. Every time you use a tool, you are engaging in a behaviour that descends directly from Oldowan toolmaking. Every time you learn how to use a new tool, you are going through the same process of observation and practice that early toolmakers went through. Every time you teach someone else how to do something, you are transmitting knowledge the way our ancestors transmitted knowledge about stoneworking. We are the inheritors and the continuators of the most basic pattern of human behaviour. The tools themselves have changed radically. The cognitive demands have changed. The social structures have become vastly more complex. But the fundamental pattern remains. We are problem solvers. We are tool makers. We are learners and teachers. We are creatures who preserve and transmit and accumulate knowledge across generations. This is what we have been since the beginning, and in many ways, this is what we still are. Looking back at our ancestors working stone on the African landscape millions of years ago, we see the seeds of everything that would follow. We see the birth of technology, the birth of culture, the birth of human civilization. We see the moment when consciousness began to extend beyond the immediate experience of an individual and began to be preserved and transmitted through communities and across generations. We see the beginning of the great project of human achievement that would eventually transform the planet. And yet, we should also recognise that our ancestors were not primitive or stupid or deficient. They faced immense challenges with limited resources, and they created elegant solutions. The Oldowan toolmakers solved real problems in ways that allowed their lineage to persist and eventually flourish. The Acheulean toolmakers created tools of beauty and effectiveness that allowed them to hunt large animals and survive in diverse environments. They were intelligent, creative, curious beings working within the constraints of their world, doing their best to survive and thrive. We should honour their achievement. As our journey through time draws toward its close, let us return, slowly, to the present moment. Imagine yourself back in the world you know, comfortable, warm, perhaps preparing for sleep. The ancient African landscape is fading like a dream. The sound of wind across dry plains, the calls of animals in the distance, the crack of stone being struck, these sounds are becoming quieter, more distant. But before we fully return to the present, take a moment to feel the weight of what you have just experienced. You have travelled back through millions of years. You have walked in the footsteps of our ancestors. You have felt the landscape they inhabited and understood the challenges they faced. You have witnessed the moment when consciousness first learned to reshape matter, when the human mind first discovered its own power to create. When you close your eyes tonight, perhaps you will continue to see images from this journey. Perhaps you will dream of African landscapes and stone tools and the faces of our ancestors. These dreams are not escape from reality, but a connection to it, a connection to the deep time that flows through all of us, to the millions of years of human ancestry that run through our blood. Think now about your hands, resting on the surface where you lie or sit. These hands are ancient beyond measure. They carry in their structure the memory of millions of years. They descend from hands that learned to make the first tools. They are instruments of the same creativity, the same problem-solving capacity, the same drive to improve and innovate that moved our ancestors to strike stone against stone. In the coming days and weeks as you go about your life, you may notice yourself using tools. Obvious ones like knives and forks, pens and scissors, more subtle ones like books and computers and machines. In those moments, you might pause and remember this journey. You might remember that you are participating in a tradition that stretches back 2.6 million years. You might remember that every tool you use is the latest expression of that fundamental human drive to solve problems through creativity and ingenuity. The story we have traced tonight is not finished. In fact, it continues. After the Acheulean comes the Oldowan. No, I'm speaking the wrong way. After the Acheulean comes further evolution, further development, new tool technologies, new capabilities, eventually the emergence of modern humans with the capacity for complex language and abstract thought, and the ability to create art and music and literature. But that is a story for another time, another journey into the past. For now, we have traced the first chapter of the story, the chapter where tool making began. We have seen how a simple idea, that stone can be deliberately changed to become more useful, eventually led to the emergence of human culture, to the development of increasingly sophisticated technology, and ultimately to the complex world we inhabit today. As you prepare to sleep or as you return to your daily activities, carry with you this understanding. You are a tool maker. This is not something you do, it is something you are. It is written into your biology and into your culture. It is part of what makes you human. Your ancestors were tool makers. Your descendants will be tool makers. In this continuity, in this unbroken chain of learning and innovation and creation that stretches back to the beginning of human history. You are connected to something profound and ancient and essential. The world of our early ancestors is gone. The African landscapes of 2 million years ago, with their different animals and different climate, exist now only in the fossil record and in our imagination. But the wisdom of those ancestors, the understanding that problems can be solved through creativity, that knowledge can be preserved and transmitted, that small improvements maintained consistently can lead to great achievements, that wisdom remains. It is as relevant today as it was millions of years ago. So now, as this journey comes to a close, I want to thank you for walking with me through deep time. Thank you for being present with our ancestors, for trying to understand their minds and their accomplishments, for recognizing in them something of yourself. This kind of attention, the willingness to understand and empathize with those who came before us, is itself a distinctly human capacity. It is what allows us to learn from history, to be shaped by it, to draw wisdom from the experiences of others. Before we part ways, I want to make a gentle request. If this journey has resonated with you, if you have found meaning or beauty or insight in tracing the roots of human toolmaking, I would be grateful if you would consider liking this video and subscribing to the Whispers of Time channel. By doing so, you ensure that these kinds of historical journeys continue. You become part of a community of people interested in understanding our past and drawing wisdom from it. You help preserve these stories and make them available to others who are seeking connection with deep time and with the ancestors who have shaped our world. You can also share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're listening from. Tell me what part of this journey resonated most strongly with you. Did you feel connected to our ancestors? Did you find yourself imagining their world? Did their struggle and innovation move you? These reflections matter. They matter because they keep the conversation alive, because they allow us to learn from each other. And know that wherever you are, whatever you're facing, you carry within you the legacy of 2.6 million years of human problem solving, innovation, and creativity. When you face a challenge, remember that your ancestors faced challenges too. When you imagine a better future, remember that imagination is one of our most fundamental human capacities. When you learn something new or teach something to another person, remember that you are participating in one of the oldest traditions of human culture, the tradition of preserving and transmitting knowledge. The tools have changed, but the human spirit that created them remains. That spirit lives in you. It is the spark of consciousness that looked at the world and asked, how can this be better? How can I reshape what I find to better serve my needs and the needs of those I love? That question, first asked millions of years ago on an African landscape, continues to be asked today. And in asking it and in working to answer it, we honour the long line of ancestors who came before us. May this journey bring you peace as you drift into sleep or return to your waking activities. May you carry forward the wisdom of our ancestors, the knowledge that problems can be solved, that knowledge can be preserved, that creativity and imagination are fundamental to our nature. May you continue the great work that began when the first conscious being struck stone against stone and discovered that the world could be changed. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Thank you for being present with our ancestors and thank you for being part of the continuing story of human innovation and creativity that began 2.6 million years ago and continues to this very moment. I am your guide through whispers of time, and I invite you to return again soon. There are many more journeys to take, many more chapters of history to explore, many more ancestors to honour and learn from. The past is waiting, deep and patient, full of wisdom and wonder. All we have to do is listen and remember. Sleep well and dream of ancient landscapes and the hands of our ancestors shaping stone into tools that would change the world, opportunities for learning and innovation. It means more chances for new techniques to be discovered and disseminated. But all of this is still to come. In this moment of first striking stone against stone, in this moment when a conscious being deliberately changes the world around it for the first time, something unprecedented has happened. A new force has entered the story of Earth's evolution. It is not biological force, though it is driven by biological creatures. It is cultural force, the ability to accumulate, preserve and refine knowledge across generations. This force will accelerate and compound over the eons. It will eventually transform the planet. But for now, in these first moments, it is small and fragile. It exists only in a few minds in Africa. It could be lost. It could be forgotten. It could die out if a catastrophe strikes, if the social structures break down, if the knowledge fails to transmit to the next generation. But it won't be lost. It will persist, and it will grow. And from this first striking of stone against stone, there will eventually flow forth all of human civilization.